In a busy American neighborhood, Malik Thompson lived quietly on Maple Street, a black man whose kindness was often mistaken for danger. When a neighbor's home was robbed and $50,000 vanished, suspicion fell on him. Cameras showed him nearby. A witness claimed his hoodie matched the thief's. The town was ready to condemn him, but Malik refused to stay silent. An elderly white neighbor he had helped stepped forward with a time-stamped photo proving his innocence. The real thief was caught, and the community was forced to confront its prejudice. Justice did more than clear his name. It changed hearts. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe some heroes are willing to look guilty to save the innocent, this story is for you. Early autumn settled gently over Cedar Grove. A thin layer of morning fog drifted between brick storefronts and maple trees, just beginning to turn amber. The air was cool, but not yet cold, the kind of weather that carried the faint scent of wet pavement and fallen leaves. Maple Street, though small, hummed with quiet activity. Delivery trucks idling, cafe doors chiming open, joggers passing beneath the soft gray sky. At the far end of the block stood a narrow, aging duplex with peeling white paint and a sagging porch rail. That was where Malik Thompson lived. Malik Thompson was 29 years old. He stood just over 6 feet tall with a lean, athletic build shaped not by gym memberships, but by years of hands-on electrical work. His skin was a deep brown, smooth but marked faintly along his knuckles from long hours gripping tools. He kept his hair cut close to his scalp. Tight, disciplined, practical, his face carried a strong jawline and steady dark eyes that rarely lingered too long on anyone. He moved with quiet control, shoulders slightly drawn inward as if he had learned to make himself smaller in spaces that did not welcome him. Malik worked as a residential electrician. He repaired faulty wiring, installed lighting systems, and rewired older homes that still hummed with outdated circuits. His hands were precise and steady. His voice was low and calm. He did not speak unless necessary, and when he did, he chose his words carefully. Years of being misunderstood had shaped that habit. He had learned that silence often protected him better than explanation. He rented the lower half of the duplex. Inside, his home was modest but neat. A small brown couch sat against the wall, facing a second-hand wooden coffee table scarred with old ring stains. On the kitchen counter rested a tidy row of labeled containers, rice, pasta, beans, organized with quiet discipline. The walls were mostly bare except for a framed photograph of his late mother, Angela Thompson, a nurse who had raised him alone. She had been a slender woman with soft eyes and tireless hands, and she had taught him one thing above all else: let your character speak, even when your voice cannot. Malik carried those words like armor. Yet on Maple Street, armor was necessary. The neighbors knew him, but not truly. They knew the outline of him. The tall, black man who lived alone. The man who walked to work with a toolbox in one hand. The man who nodded politely but never lingered in conversation. They knew the surface, and the surface was enough for suspicion. Across the street lived Mrs. Eleanor Whitman. Eleanor Whitman was 72 years old, a widow with a narrow frame that seemed even smaller beneath her oversized knit cardigans. Her silver-white hair was always swept into a careful bun at the back of her head. Fine wrinkles lined her pale skin, especially around her eyes, which were once bright blue but now carried a permanent haze of worry. She walked with a slight tremor in her hands and a cautious step, her posture slightly stooped from years of arthritis. She had lost her husband, Daniel Whitman, a retired school principal, 5 years earlier. Since then, silence had filled her home. Her only son, Michael, had moved to Oregon for work and visited only twice a year. Loneliness had slowly shaped Eleanor's temperament. She had grown wary of change, protective of routine, suspicious of unfamiliar faces. When Malik first moved in, Eleanor had watched from behind her lace curtains. She had not spoken to him, not once. Whenever he passed by her gate, she instinctively reached for the curtain and pulled it shut. It was not hatred, she would have insisted. It was caution, but caution, repeated enough times, becomes something else. One afternoon, a small incident rippled quietly through the street. Malik was returning from a service call when he noticed Mrs. Whitman struggling with a grocery bag at the edge of the sidewalk. The thin plastic had torn, and apples rolled across the pavement. A jar of pasta sauce had cracked open, bleeding red across the concrete. Without hesitation, Malik stepped forward. "Ma'am, let me help you," he said gently. Eleanor stiffened at the sound of his voice. Her grip tightened around her purse strap. For a brief second, fear flashed across her face, a reflex born of years of watching news segments that painted men like Malik as danger before they were anything else. But he was already kneeling, carefully gathering apples and placing the unbroken items back into the bag. He avoided sudden movements. He kept his voice soft. "You drop this," he added, handing her the last apple. She hesitated before accepting it. "Thank you," she murmured, barely meeting his eyes. He nodded once and walked away. From her porch, she watched him go. Confusion lingered in her expression as though kindness from him did not fit the narrative she had quietly constructed in her mind. It was not the first time Malik's help had been received with discomfort. 2 weeks earlier, he had returned a misdelivered package to a young couple, Brian and Laura Keller. Brian was a broad-shouldered man in his mid-30s with sandy hair and a perpetual crease between his brows. Laura, petite with long blonde hair and bright, alert eyes, worked from home and often peered through the blinds at passing movement. When Malik knocked on their door holding the box, Brian opened it halfway, his body blocking the entrance. "Can I help you?" Brian asked, tone tight. "Package was delivered to my place by mistake," Malik replied, extending it forward. Brian glanced at the label, then at Malik, as if weighing some invisible risk. He took the box quickly and closed the door without another word. Inside, Laura whispered, "See? I told you to get a camera." Malik heard the lock click from outside. He said nothing. There was also Daisy, the golden retriever belonging to Mrs. Porter, a cheerful middle-aged woman who ran the flower shop down the block. Daisy was 3 years old, with thick honey-colored fur and a permanently wagging tail. One afternoon, Daisy slipped her leash and darted into the street. Malik reacted instantly, stepping into traffic and catching her collar before a delivery van rounded the corner. Mrs. Porter rushed over, breathless and pale. "Oh my goodness, thank you!" she exclaimed, clutching Daisy. For a moment, gratitude overcame everything else. But later that evening, another neighbor was overheard saying, "It's lucky he was there, I guess." Lucky, as though his presence was coincidence rather than character. Malik learned to absorb these moments without reaction. He kept his posture neutral, his gaze steady, his tone measured. Inside, however, a quiet ache formed, a constant awareness that, in the eyes of many, he was not an individual. He was a possibility, a risk. And then there was Chief Harold Benson. Chief Benson was 58 years old, a stocky man with thinning gray hair combed stiffly to the side. His square jaw and heavy brow gave him a permanent look of disapproval. His uniform was always immaculate, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. He had served Cedar Grove for over 30 years and carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to authority. Benson believed in order, in efficiency, in keeping things simple. Months earlier, Malik had encountered him at a grocery store parking lot. A blue sedan, marked Police Chief, was parked diagonally across a clearly marked, accessible space. Malik had hesitated, then approached respectfully. "Sir, someone might need that space," he said quietly. Benson turned slowly, eyes narrowing. "You telling me how to do my job?" he replied. "No, sir. Just pointing it out." The exchange lasted less than a minute, but Benson's pride had been bruised. In his mind, the young electrician had overstepped, From that day forward, Benson regarded Malik not as a citizen, but as a challenge. And in small towns, challenges are remembered. As autumn deepened, Maple Street continued its rhythm. Children rode bikes in the afternoon. Shop owners swept sidewalks at closing time. Mrs. Whitman watered her hydrangeas with trembling hands. Malik continued waking at 6, brewing black coffee, and stepping into the morning fog with his toolbox. He kept living. Quietly. But beneath the surface of Maple Street, something unspoken simmered. A tension woven from glances held too long. From conversations lowered when he walked past. From assumptions made before facts were known. Malik felt it. He always had. Still, he chose kindness. Not because it was returned, but because it defined him. He did not know that soon, that quiet strength would be tested. For now, Maple Street remained calm, and Malik Thompson remained the man who lived alone at the end of the block, seen by everyone, known by none. The morning broke clearer than the one before. The fog had lifted early, leaving Cedar Grove washed in pale sunlight. Maple Street stirred awake with its usual rhythm, coffee brewing, sprinklers ticking across trimmed lawns, delivery trucks humming past storefronts. Nothing in the air suggested that by noon, the neighborhood would no longer feel the same. Richard Collins had left his house just after 6. Richard was 61 years old, a tall, broad-shouldered man whose once athletic build had softened slightly with age. His hair, thick and iron gray, was always brushed neatly back, and his jaw carried the stubborn firmness of someone accustomed to being in control. A retired financial consultant, Richard valued order and predictability. His life had been built on calculated risk, careful investment, and discipline. He ran every morning, not just for health, but because routine steadied him. He wore a navy tracksuit and expensive running shoes, a smartwatch strapped tightly around his wrist. His face, weathered but strong, carried the faint flush of exertion as he jogged along the paved path of Willow Park, nearly 3 kilometers from Maple Street. Halfway through his cool-down stretch, his phone vibrated. The call came from his neighbor 2 doors down, Sandra Miller. Sandra Miller was a 45-year-old elementary school teacher with curly auburn hair that refused to stay tamed even in a ponytail. She was medium height, slightly round in build, with expressive hazel eyes that tended to widen when anxious. Years of managing energetic children had made her patient, but also prone to worry quickly when something seemed wrong. "Richard," she said breathlessly the moment he answered, "you need to come home. Your front gate, it looks damaged, and I think your door is open." Richard's stomach tightened. "What do you mean, open?" "I didn't go inside, but something isn't right." He didn't wait for more. By the time he reached Maple Street, his breathing was no longer from exercise. It was sharp, uneven, fueled by something colder. The wrought iron front gate of his property had been pulled off its hinges. It lay tilted awkwardly against the hedge, one hinge bent outward as if forced with deliberate pressure. His front door stood slightly ajar. The brass lock hung broken, pieces scattered across the tiled entryway. For a moment, Richard simply stood there. Then he stepped inside. The house was not ransacked wildly. It was worse than that. It was deliberate. Drawers in his study had been opened and closed again. Papers were shifted, but not destroyed. A small painting in the hallway hung slightly crooked. Whoever had entered had not searched blindly. They had known where to look. Richard moved straight to the wall, safe concealed behind a framed landscape. The frame was removed. The safe door was open. Empty. His jaw tightened. Inside that safe had been $50,000 in cash, money withdrawn gradually over months. He had planned to invest it quietly in a private opportunity that had not yet formalized into paperwork. He trusted his own discretion more than banks. Now the space was hollow. Within minutes, Maple Street filled with flashing red and blue. Chief Harold Benson arrived in his patrol SUV, stepping out with measured authority. The morning sunlight reflected sharply off his badge. His thick frame filled the doorway as he surveyed the broken lock and bent gate. 50,000, Benson repeated, brows lifting slightly. You kept that much in cash? Richard's voice was steady, but edged with humiliation. It was secure. Benson nodded once, though something flickered in his eyes, calculation, not sympathy. Patrol officers moved through the house. One of them was Officer Daniel Ruiz, a young officer in his late 20s, lean and serious, with closely cropped black hair and alert dark eyes. Ruiz was relatively new to Cedar Grove, transferred from a busier district in the city. He carried himself with cautious professionalism, not yet hardened by small-town politics. Minimal forced entry, Ruiz observed quietly to Benson. Gate hinge was removed cleanly. That's not random. Benson grunted. Means they had time. Outside, neighbors gathered in clusters along sidewalks. Brian Keller stood with his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Laura hovered beside him, whispering. Mrs. Porter held Daisy close, the dog sensing tension and whimpering softly. Sandra Miller wrung her hands near the curb, and across the street, behind lace curtains, Eleanor Whitman watched. Malik Thompson returned from his early service call just before 10. He noticed the police vehicles immediately. His steps slowed. For a brief moment, instinct told him to keep walking, but curiosity and concern pulled him closer. He remained at the edge of the sidewalk, hands visible, posture neutral. Officer Ruiz glanced up and made eye contact. "Morning," Ruiz said evenly. "Morning," Malik replied. It lasted only a second, but it did not go unnoticed. Brian Keller leaned toward Laura. "He was walking by earlier," he murmured. Laura nodded quickly. "I saw him, around 8 maybe." Sandra added, uncertainly, "I think I did too." It was true. Malik had passed by Maple Street at approximately 8:12 a.m. on his way to a wiring job 2 blocks over. He walked that route often. Across the street, mounted under the eaves of the Keller home, a small black security camera blinked silently. By early afternoon, Chief Benson stood reviewing preliminary footage inside his vehicle. Grainy clips showed the quiet street in segments of time. At 7:58 a.m., nothing unusual. At 8:12 a.m., Malik appeared in frame, walking steadily down the sidewalk, toolbox in hand. Benson paused the video. "There," he muttered. Ruiz leaned closer. "He's just walking." "Walking where?" Benson replied. "Toward the corner, same direction he takes most mornings." Benson's lips pressed thin. "Convenient." He rewound again, played it slower. Malik's face was partially visible as he passed under the camera's angle, his expression unreadable, neutral. "Let's pull footage from Miller's house, too," Benson ordered. Another camera, another angle. Again, Malik appeared briefly in frame. The timing overlapped roughly with the estimated window of entry. Inside Benson's mind, pieces began forming, not necessarily facts, but a shape, a direction, a conclusion that felt simpler than uncertainty. Outside, word traveled faster than official statements. By evening, Maple Street no longer buzzed with confusion, it simmered with suspicion. At the small corner cafe, whispers floated over ceramic cups. 50,000 in cash, someone said. Who would even know about that? Someone who lives nearby, another voice replied. Malik sat alone at a table near the window, unaware of how tightly the narrative was already closing around him. He stirred his coffee slowly, eyes lowered. His posture remained the same, controlled, quiet. But he felt the shift in the air, the glances that lasted a beat too long, the conversations that stopped when he looked up. He paid his bill and left. As he walked home, he noticed Chief Benson standing near Richard Collins's driveway speaking firmly to Officer Ruiz. Benson's gaze shifted, locked onto Malik, For just a moment, neither man looked away. In Benson's expression there was something new, not anger, not yet accusation. Opportunity. By nightfall, Maple Street's porch lights glowed brighter than usual. Doors were double-checked. Security apps were downloaded. Conversations replayed the same details. And somewhere inside a quiet patrol vehicle, Chief Harold Benson made a decision. This case would not take long. By the third morning after the break-in, Maple Street no longer felt like a neighborhood. It felt like a jury box without walls. Curtains twitched more often. Conversations lowered when footsteps approached. Even the autumn air seemed sharper, carrying suspicion like static. Malik was replacing a ceiling fixture in a modest ranch house on Cedar Avenue when his phone vibrated in his pocket. He climbed down the ladder carefully before answering. "Malik Thompson?" The voice was firm, official. "Yes." "This is Officer Daniel Ruiz from Cedar Grove Police. Chief Benson would like you to come down to the station this afternoon. We have a few questions about the Collins burglary." The word burglary hung between them. Malik's expression did not change, but something tightened behind his eyes. "I'll be there after I finish this job," he replied evenly. At the station, the fluorescent lights hummed faintly above scuffed tile floors. The walls were painted a neutral beige, meant to feel calming but instead emphasizing every shadow. Chief Harold Benson stood near the interrogation room door when Malik arrived. Up close, Benson's presence felt heavier than his build suggested. His shoulders were squared, jaw set tight, eyes calculating. He gestured toward the small room without offering a handshake. "Have a seat." The metal chair scraped softly against the floor as Malik sat down. His back remained straight, hands resting loosely on the table. Officer Ruiz stood off to the side, holding a small notepad. Unlike Benson, Ruiz's posture carried uncertainty. His brows were drawn slightly together as if weighing something he wasn't entirely comfortable with. Benson leaned forward. "You were seen near Richard Collins' house the morning of the theft." "I walk that route most mornings," Malik replied calmly. "At 8:12, Benson pressed. "Right around the estimated time of entry." Malik met his gaze. "I was on my way to a job on Cedar Avenue. You can call the homeowner." "We will." Benson slid a printed still image across the table. It was grainy, Malik mid-step, toolbox in hand. "That you?" "Yes." "You understand how this looks?" Malik's jaw tightened slightly. "It looks like me walking to work." Benson exhaled sharply, irritation flickering. "Someone reported seeing a man run from Collins's property wearing a dark hoodie. You own a dark hoodie." "That's not a crime." Ruiz shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Benson's tone lowered, less overtly aggressive, more insinuating. "Sometimes people make mistakes. Financial pressure, poor judgment. $50,000 is a temptation." Malik's hands remained steady on the table. "I didn't take anything." The silence stretched. Benson studied him as if waiting for cracks. When none appeared, he leaned back. "We'll be in touch," he said curtly. Outside the station, late afternoon sunlight cast long shadows across the parking lot. Malik paused before getting into his truck, aware of how quickly an accusation could become a verdict in people's minds. Back on Maple Street, the narrative had already begun shifting. Tom Bradley stood near the curb, speaking animatedly to a small cluster of neighbors. Tom was 54, tall and narrow-shouldered, with thinning sandy hair and a sharp nose that gave his face a permanently skeptical look. He worked as a regional sales manager and carried himself with restless energy, always slightly on edge. Years ago, he had been laid off unexpectedly during a corporate restructuring, an event that hardened his worldview. Since then, he believed strongly in self-protection and trusting your instincts. "I'm telling you," Tom insisted, arms folded tightly. "I saw someone come off that driveway. Hoodie pulled up. Same build." Brian Keller nodded slowly. "You sure?" As sure as I can be. Could have been anyone, Sandra Miller offered cautiously. Tom shook his head. No, same height, same walk. The phrase, same walk, lingered. Across the street, Eleanor Whitman stood just inside her doorway, listening. Her pale hands gripped the edge of the doorframe. She could hear Tom's voice clearly through the open air, each word pressed against something inside her chest. She remembered that morning. The grocery bag tearing, the apples rolling. Malik kneeling without hesitation. The faint click of her phone camera when she had awkwardly asked him to hold still so she could send a picture to her granddaughter. Proof, she had told herself, that kindness still existed in the world. She hadn't intended it as evidence, just a story to share. Now, her memory felt heavier. Inside her living room, her old tabby cat, Winston, jumped onto the windowsill. Winston was 12 years old, gray-striped with a thick tail and one torn ear from a long-ago neighborhood scuffle. He moved slowly now, joints stiff with age, but his green eyes remained sharp. He watched the street below with feline detachment. Eleanor sank into her armchair. What if they're wrong? She whispered to no one. Her late husband's photograph sat on the mantel, a younger Daniel Whitman in a tweed jacket smiling confidently. Daniel had always believed in fairness. He had once confronted a school board member publicly over an unjust suspension. That memory pricked her conscience. But stepping forward would mean admitting something else, that she had misjudged Malik from the beginning. That frightened her more than she expected. Meanwhile, inside his small duplex, Malik sat at his kitchen table, staring at the framed photograph of his mother. He replayed the interrogation in his mind. Not the words, but the tone. He knew that tone. He had heard it before, in other cities, in other rooms. The quiet presumption that proximity equals guilt, that silence equals hiding. His phone buzzed again. A text from his friend, Marcus Hill. Marcus was 32, slightly shorter than Malik but broader in build, with warm brown skin and a neatly trimmed beard. He worked as a mechanic across town and had known Malik since high school. Marcus possessed an easy laugh and an open nature, but life had taught him caution too. You good? The message read. Malik typed back, Yeah. Another pause, then, You sure? Malik hesitated before responding. Not sure it matters. Outside, a patrol car rolled slowly down Maple Street, Chief Benson inside. He did not stop. He did not need to. Visibility was enough. By evening, Tom Bradley had formally given his statement at the station. In the small interview room, he leaned forward, confident. I didn't see his face clearly, Tom admitted, but I know what I saw. Same build, same hoodie. Benson nodded, satisfied. That's helpful, he said. Officer Ruiz scribbled notes, his expression guarded. Did you see the person enter the house? Ruiz asked carefully. No. Did you see them leave with anything? No, but you're confident it was him. Tom's jaw tightened. I trust my instincts. That phrase again. Outside, Maple Street's porch lights flicked on one by one as darkness settled. Malik stepped onto his porch briefly to take out the trash. Across the street, Eleanor's curtain shifted. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. She looked away first. The shift in the neighborhood was no longer subtle. It had weight. People who once ignored him now watched openly. Conversations stopped entirely when he approached. The invisible distance had become visible. Later that night, Chief Benson sat at his desk reviewing the collected statements and footage. On the surface, it was circumstantial, but in his mind, it was aligning. Proximity, witness description, opportunity. He tapped his pen against the desk slowly. He fits, Benson muttered. Officer Ruiz, standing near the doorway, remained silent. Maple Street slept uneasily, and Malik Thompson, who had done nothing more than walk to work that morning, now found himself standing at the center of a story he had not written. the man in the crosshairs. The morning of the hearing arrived with a cold clarity that made Cedar Grove feel exposed. The sky was a hard, uninterrupted blue, and the wind carried the dry rustle of late autumn leaves along the courthouse steps. Maple Street residents gathered earlier than necessary as if attendance itself were a civic duty. Some came out of curiosity. Others came seeking confirmation of what they already believed. The Cedar Grove Municipal Courthouse stood modest but imposing, its pale stone facade worn smooth by decades of small-town disputes. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed softly above polished wooden benches. Malik Thompson entered without escort, though 2 officers stood nearby. He wore a clean, dark gray button-down shirt tucked neatly into pressed black slacks. His posture was straight, shoulders controlled, chin level. He did not look at the cluster of neighbors filling the gallery, but he felt their eyes. Richard Collins sat in the front row, hands clasped tightly over one knee. He wore a charcoal suit that hung slightly looser than usual, as if stress had trimmed him down. His jaw remained set in a rigid line. Though anger still simmered beneath his expression, there was something else now. Injured pride. The theft had violated more than his property. It had shaken his sense of control. Beside him sat Sandra Miller, twisting a tissue between her fingers. Tom Bradley occupied the second row, arms crossed, gaze unwavering. His lips were drawn thin with certainty. And near the aisle, Eleanor Whitman sat quietly, back straight, hands folded in her lap. She wore a navy wool coat over a cream blouse, her silver hair pinned tightly into place. She looked smaller than usual inside the courtroom, but her eyes were alert, watching, absorbing. At precisely 9 o'clock, Judge Alan Mercer entered. Judge Mercer was 63 years old, tall and slender, with a narrow face framed by neatly combed white hair. His glasses perched low on a sharp nose, giving him a perpetually scrutinizing gaze. Years on the bench had etched fine lines around his mouth, and he carried himself with a blend of intellectual confidence and subtle impatience. Efficiency mattered to him. He disliked prolonged proceedings, especially in what he considered straightforward matters. He adjusted his robe as he took his seat. Let's proceed. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Claire Whitfield, stood. Claire Whitfield was 40 years old, composed and sharp-eyed, with dark chestnut hair pulled into a sleek low bun. She wore a navy suit tailored to precision, and her posture reflected disciplined ambition. She had built her reputation on conviction rates, not controversy. To her, cases were puzzles meant to be solved quickly and cleanly. "Your Honor," she began, voice clear and measured, "the defendant, Mr. Malik Thompson, was observed near the victim's property at the estimated time of the burglary." She gestured toward a monitor displaying the still images from the security cameras. Grainy footage filled the screen. "There," she said, pointing. 8:12 a.m. Mr. Thompson passes directly in front of the residence. Malik remained still. Claire continued. "Furthermore, witness testimony places a man of similar height and build fleeing the property wearing a dark hoodie consistent with one owned by the defendant." Tom Bradley shifted slightly in his seat, satisfied. "And finally," Claire added, glancing briefly at her notes, "the defendant lives alone. There are no individuals who can verify his whereabouts during the precise moment of entry." The phrase hung in the air like smoke. Judge Mercer leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Thompson," he said, voice even, "do you intend to contest these claims?" Malik rose slowly. His movements were controlled, deliberate. His voice, when he spoke, was steady. "Yes, Your Honor." Claire's expression remained neutral, but her eyes sharpened. "You deny being present at the Collins residence?" "I deny entering the property," Malik replied. "I was walking to work. Yet no one can confirm that." Malik paused, not because he lacked an answer, but because he understood what the room wanted. "I can confirm it," he said calmly, "and I will." A faint murmur rippled through the gallery. Judge Mercer lifted a hand. Order. Claire approached the bench slightly. Your Honor, we have witness Tom Bradley. Tom stood, straightened his jacket, and took the stand. His voice carried confidence. I saw someone running from Mr. Collins's driveway, he said. Same height, same build. Dark hoodie. Are you certain? Claire asked. As certain as I can be. Malik watched quietly. His attorney, a public defender named Laura Chen, rose to cross-examine. Laura Chen was 35, petite, but fierce in demeanor. Her black hair was cut in a sharp bob, framing determined eyes. Years earlier, her own father had been wrongfully accused in a minor fraud case that nearly destroyed their family business. Since then, Laura had devoted herself to defending those society judged too quickly. Mr. Bradley, she began, voice composed. Did you see the individual's face? No. Did you see him enter the house? No. Did you see him carrying any property? Tom hesitated. No. Laura nodded slightly. So, what you are certain of is clothing and general build? Yes. Laura let the silence stretch briefly. Would you agree that many men in Cedar Grove own dark hoodies? A faint ripple of discomfort passed through the room. Tom shifted. I suppose. Laura returned to her seat. Judge Mercer's fingers tapped lightly against the bench. He turned toward Malik. Mr. Thompson, do you have anything to add before we move forward? Malik stood again. This time, his gaze swept briefly across the courtroom. He saw the neighbors, the whispers, the assumptions resting on their faces. If I remain silent, he said evenly, then silence becomes guilt. I won't do that. His voice did not rise. It did not plead. It simply held steady. I was near the property because I walked that route to work. I did not enter Mr. Collins's home. I did not take his money. Claire's lips pressed together faintly. Judge Mercer adjusted his glasses. Do you have an alibi? Malik paused only for a heartbeat. Yes, Your Honor. The room stilled. I would like the opportunity to present it. Judge Mercer glanced toward the prosecutor, then back at Malik. His expression reflected irritation more than curiosity. This court prefers efficiency, he said. If you have an alibi, present it through proper channels. I will, Malik replied. In the gallery, Eleanor Whitman's fingers tightened around her purse strap. Her heart beat faster. She knew exactly where Malik had been. The memory of apples rolling across pavement flashed through her mind again. The timestamp on her phone. The photograph she had taken without thinking. But fear pressed against her ribs. Admitting the truth meant confronting her own prejudice. It meant stepping into a room where everyone already believed something else. She looked toward Malik. He stood alone at the defense table. Not angry, not pleading, just present. Judge Mercer rapped his gavel lightly. This matter will proceed. Further evidence may be submitted. Court adjourned for recess. The gavel's echo lingered longer than it should have. As people rose from their seats, whispers began again. Looks bad, someone muttered. Doesn't have anyone to back him up, another voice added. Malik gathered his papers quietly. Laura Chen leaned toward him. Do you have something solid? She asked softly. Yes, Malik answered. Then we use it. He nodded once. Across the aisle, Eleanor remained seated a moment longer than the rest. Her breathing was shallow. The photograph still sat in her phone, and the weight of it grew heavier with each passing second. The courtroom reconvened just after noon. Sunlight streamed through the tall rectangular windows, casting pale gold bands across the polished wooden floor. The earlier murmur of confidence from the gallery had softened into quiet anticipation. People leaned forward slightly in their seats as though sensing something unfinished hung in the air. Malik Thompson stood beside his attorney, Laura Chen. His posture was the same, measured, composed. But there was a subtle firmness in his stance now, like a man who had decided that silence would no longer serve him. Judge Alan Mercer adjusted his glasses and nodded toward the defense table. "Mr. Thompson," he said, voice clipped with restrained impatience, "you indicated you have an alibi to present. This court will hear it." Malik stepped forward. "At approximately 8:10 that morning," he began, voice calm and clear, "I was on Maple Street near Mrs. Whitman's home. She dropped a grocery bag. I helped her gather the items." A faint ripple of laughter moved through the gallery. Someone muttered, "Convenient." Claire Whitfield, the prosecutor, did not laugh, but her lips curved slightly in restrained skepticism. "You are suggesting," she said evenly, "that during the exact window of the burglary, you were assisting an elderly neighbor with groceries." "Yes." "And this neighbor is prepared to testify?" Malik hesitated only long enough to answer honestly. "I believe she is." A few heads turned instinctively toward the gallery. Eleanor Whitman's usual seat was empty. The silence stretched thin. Judge Mercer tapped his pen against the bench. "Mr. Thompson, without corroboration, this is merely your word." Laura Chen rose smoothly. "Your Honor, the defense requests a brief pause. We have reason to believe corroboration is available." Before Mercer could respond, the heavy wooden courtroom door creaked open. Every head turned. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman stood in the doorway. She looked smaller than usual, dwarfed by the tall frame of the entrance. She wore a pale blue coat buttoned tightly at the collar, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her handbag. Her silver hair was pinned neatly, but a few strands had come loose around her temples. Her expression carried something new. Not fear, not confusion, but resolve. The courtroom fell into complete silence. She walked forward slowly, each step deliberate. Officer Ruiz, standing near the wall, straightened slightly, recognizing the shift in atmosphere. Judge Mercer leaned forward. "Ma'am, please identify yourself for the record." "Eleanor Whitman," she said softly. Her voice trembled at first, but steadied as she continued. "I live across from Mr. Thompson." Claire Whitfield's composure flickered, just briefly. Laura Chen approached Eleanor gently. "Mrs. Whitman, were you outside your home on the morning of the burglary?" "Yes," Eleanor replied. "I had just returned from the market. My bag tore. Groceries fell into the street." She swallowed, glancing once toward Malik. "He helped me." A murmur began again, but it was different this time. Uncertain, uneasy. "At what time did this occur?" Laura asked. Eleanor opened her handbag carefully and removed her phone. It was an older model, encased in a floral cover slightly worn at the edges. "I don't remember the exact minute," she admitted. "But I took a picture." Claire's head tilted slightly. "A picture?" Eleanor nodded. "I wanted to send it to my granddaughter. I told her I'd met a kind young man who helped me." She fumbled gently with the screen, her fingers stiff from arthritis. Laura stepped closer to assist, but Eleanor shook her head lightly. "I can manage." After a few moments, the image appeared. Laura requested it be displayed on the courtroom monitor. The screen flickered to life. There, under bright morning sunlight, stood Eleanor Whitman and Malik Thompson on Maple Street. Malik held 2 recovered grocery items in his hands. Eleanor's expression in the photo was shy but smiling. In the bottom corner of the image, 8:14 a.m. The timestamp was clear. The room inhaled as one. Judge Mercer leaned forward sharply. Claire Whitfield's posture stiffened. Officer Ruiz glanced at Chief Benson, whose jaw tightened visibly. "That timestamp," Laura said calmly, "places Mr. Thompson across the street at the time the burglary was estimated to have occurred." Claire stepped forward quickly. "Your Honor, timestamps can be manipulated." Eleanor interrupted softly but firmly. I don't know how to manipulate anything. I barely know how to use that phone." A faint, unexpected ripple of restrained laughter moved through the room, but this time it did not carry mockery. It carried release. Laura continued, "Furthermore, Your Honor, if Mr. Thompson was assisting Mrs. Whitman at 8:14 a.m., and the prosecution's timeline places the suspect fleeing at approximately 8:12 to 8:15, the defense contends that physical impossibility undermines the accusation." Judge Mercer's fingers stilled against the bench. The earlier impatience in his expression shifted to calculation. Claire Whitfield turned slightly toward Tom Bradley in the gallery. Tom's confident posture had changed. His shoulders were no longer squared. He avoided eye contact. Laura seized the moment. "Mr. Bradley," she said, requesting he return briefly to the stand. "You testified that the individual you saw wore a dark hoodie similar to Mr. Thompson's." "Yes," Tom replied, but his voice carried less certainty now. Laura walked to the evidence table and lifted the hoodie Malik had worn that morning. It was charcoal gray, with subtle white stitching along the sleeve seams. "Is this the hoodie you saw?" Tom squinted slightly. "It was dark. Was it charcoal with white seam stitching?" I didn't notice stitching." Laura turned to the screen and requested the earlier camera still be displayed again. The image showed a blurry figure in a darker hoodie, solid black without visible detailing. "Would you agree," Laura asked carefully, "that the hoodie in the footage appears solid black?" Tom hesitated. "It's grainy." "Yes or no?" "It looks darker." "And without stitching?" Tom's jaw tightened. "I guess." A quiet shift rippled through the gallery. The narrative, once so firm, was beginning to crack. Claire Whitfield's composure remained outwardly intact, but the sharp edge of confidence had dulled. Judge Mercer cleared his throat. "This court acknowledges the significance of the submitted photograph." He looked directly at Malik. "Mr. Thompson, this alibi materially challenges the prosecution's timeline." Malik did not smile. He did not celebrate. He simply nodded once. Across the aisle, Eleanor Whitman lowered her phone slowly, her breathing steadier now. In that moment, she was no longer the woman who closed her curtains. She was a witness. The courtroom, moments earlier heavy with presumption, now felt unsteady in a different way, forced to reconsider what it had accepted too easily. Judge Mercer rapped his gavel lightly. "This matter requires further review." The sound echoed through the chamber, but this time it did not signal conclusion. It signaled pause. And in that pause, something fundamental had shifted. The courtroom emptied slower than usual that afternoon. People did not rush out with the certainty they had carried in. They lingered in the aisles, whispering in lower tones, glancing toward Malik not with accusation now, but with something closer to uncertainty. Suspicion had been easy. Reconsideration was heavier. Judge Mercer's order for further review forced the investigation back into motion. For Chief Harold Benson, that meant reopening a case he had already begun to close in his mind. 2 days later, the Collins residence was once again marked with yellow tape. Officer Daniel Ruiz stood near the broken gate, studying the metal hinge that had been carefully detached. He wore latex gloves and crouched low, examining the damage under direct morning light. "This wasn't rushed," Ruiz murmured. Beside him stood Detective Sarah Donnelly, newly assigned to assist in re-evaluating the evidence. Sarah Donnelly was 38, tall and lean with sharp cheekbones and short auburn hair cut in a practical style that framed her focused green eyes. A faint scar traced along her left wrist, a remnant from a domestic disturbance call years earlier that had nearly cost her her life. Since then, Sarah had developed a reputation for precision and patience. She did not rush conclusions. She disliked assumptions more than paperwork. She examined the lock fragments laid out in evidence bags. "Who dusted these originally?" she asked. Ruiz hesitated. "Preliminary team. Focus was mostly on entry timing." Sarah's lips pressed thin. Let's dust them again. Inside the Collins study, the safe door was still ajar. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and lingering disruption. Richard Collins stood near the doorway, arms folded tightly across his chest. He looked more fatigued now, the initial anger replaced by restless embarrassment. "I trusted the system," he said quietly. "I thought it was obvious." Sarah met his gaze evenly. Obvious isn't always accurate. She bent over the removed lock assembly. Fine powder brushed across metal. Within minutes, partial prints began emerging. Ruiz leaned in. "Those aren't Thompson's," he said carefully. The prints were lifted and compared against Malik's record, taken during the initial questioning. No match. Chief Benson arrived shortly afterward. His expression darkened as Sarah briefed him. "Fingerprint mismatch," she said evenly. "Also, the hinge removal was done with a specific torque tool. Clean extraction, not improvised." Benson crossed his arms. "You saying he didn't do it?" "I'm saying we didn't look far enough." Later that afternoon, Sarah requested expanded camera footage beyond the immediate block. A traffic camera positioned at the intersection of Maple and Birch had not been reviewed initially. Its angle captured vehicles parked along the street in the early morning hours. The footage flickered across the station monitor. At 7:46 a.m., a white pickup truck appeared, pulling slowly along Maple Street before stopping briefly 2 houses down from Collins' residence. Sarah paused the frame. Zoom. The image sharpened enough to reveal a company logo faintly visible on the truck door. Ruiz leaned closer. "That looks like Henderson Home Services." Sarah nodded slowly. Henderson Home Services was a small contracting business in Cedar Grove, specializing in interior renovations and custom installations. It had operated for over a decade. Chief Benson stiffened slightly. "Collins ever hire them?" Ruiz checked the notes. "Yes, 3 months ago. Safe installation." The room went silent. An hour later, they stood outside a modest warehouse on the edge of town. The building belonged to Kevin Henderson. Kevin Henderson was 44, medium height, stocky, with thinning blonde hair and a permanently flushed complexion. His hands were thick and calloused from years of labor. His demeanor often swung between forced charm and defensive impatience. He prided himself on being resourceful, though resourcefulness had occasionally blurred into opportunism. When officers approached, Kevin emerged from the workshop wiping his hands on a rag. "What's this about?" he asked, attempting casual indifference. Sarah stepped forward. "We need to ask about your presence on Maple Street last Tuesday morning." Kevin's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I wasn't there." Sarah held up a printed still image from the traffic camera. White pickup, Henderson Home Services logo. Kevin's eyes flickered. "That could be any morning," he said. "It was 7:46 a.m., Sarah replied calmly. "You installed Richard Collins's safe. You knew its location." Kevin shifted his weight. Inside the warehouse office, paperwork lay scattered across a cluttered desk. A small metal tool case sat partially open. Sarah knelt beside it. Inside, a torque wrench, consistent with the clean hinge removal seen at Collins' gate. Kevin's breathing grew heavier. "You don't understand," he began, voice defensive. "I was owed money. He delayed payment." Ruiz's expression hardened. "You broke in and took $50,000. Kevin hesitated. Silence answered for him. By evening, Kevin Henderson was in custody. The news moved through Cedar Grove quickly. Maple Street, once thick with suspicion, now hummed with stunned reflection. Brian Keller stood outside his home, watching the patrol car drive past. Laura remained silent beside him. Sandra Miller covered her mouth with one hand as she absorbed the update from a neighbor's phone screen. Tom Bradley avoided eye contact entirely. Across the street, Eleanor Whitman stood on her porch. Malik stepped outside his duplex cautiously, unsure of what he was about to face. For a long moment, the street felt suspended. Then Mrs. Porter approached first. "I'm sorry," she said softly, holding Daisy's leash loosely in her hand. Daisy wagged her tail tentatively, sensing tension but not understanding its cause. Malik nodded once. "It's all right." But it wasn't entirely all right. Apologies did not erase days of glances. They did not undo the weight of being measured by suspicion. Later that evening, a knock came at Malik's door. He opened it to find Eleanor Whitman standing there. She held a small tin box in her hands. "I thought," she said quietly, "perhaps you'd join me for tea." Her posture was straighter than usual, though her hands trembled slightly. Malik hesitated only briefly before nodding. Inside her living room, the air smelled faintly of chamomile and old books. Winston the tabby lay curled on the arm of the sofa, blinking slowly at the unfamiliar guest. Eleanor poured tea carefully into delicate porcelain cups. "I was wrong," she said after a moment. Malik looked at her, not with accusation but with attentiveness. "I let fear speak louder than truth," she continued. "You helped me before any of this happened. I should have spoken sooner." Malik considered her words. "You did speak," he said gently. "That's what mattered." She exhaled, relief softening her features. Outside, the streetlights flickered on. At the police station, Chief Benson stood in his office, staring at the arrest report. Kevin Henderson's confession lay on his desk. Fingerprint confirmation attached. He removed his glasses slowly and rubbed the bridge of his nose. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he stepped into the hallway and approached Malik, who had come in earlier to provide a final statement. Benson stopped a few feet away. "Thompson?" he said. Malik met his gaze. "I was wrong." The words were brief, uncomfortable, but genuine. Malik nodded once. "I know." The tension that had gripped Maple Street for days began loosening. Not erased, but altered. The truth had surfaced. And with it, the weight of assumption had shifted to those who had carried it too easily. The morning of the final ruling arrived with a gentler sky than Cedar Grove had seen in weeks. Early winter sunlight filtered through thin clouds, casting a quiet brightness over the courthouse steps. The air was crisp but not bitter, the kind of cold that felt clean rather than punishing. Maple Street residents gathered again, though this time their posture was different. They did not cluster in tight knots of certainty. They stood apart, reflective. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere lacked the sharp tension of previous hearings. There was still anticipation, but it felt heavier with humility than accusation. Malik Thompson stood beside Laura Chen once more. He wore the same controlled composure, though something subtle had shifted in his expression. The guarded tightness around his eyes had softened. He did not look defiant anymore. He looked steady. Judge Alan Mercer entered slowly, his movements more deliberate than before. The lines around his mouth seemed deeper today. He adjusted his glasses and surveyed the room, pausing slightly longer than usual before speaking. "This court has reviewed the expanded investigation findings," he began. His voice carried its usual authority, but beneath it lay a trace of gravity that had not been there before. "The evidence confirms that Mr. Malik Thompson was not responsible for the burglary at the Collins residence. The fingerprints recovered do not match the defendant. Video evidence places another individual at the scene prior to the offense. The confessed party has been charged accordingly." A faint exhale moved through the room. Judge Mercer looked directly at Malik. "Mr. Thompson," he continued, "this court acknowledges that preliminary conclusions were reached too quickly. For that, I offer my formal apology." The words settled like sunlight across the room. They were simple, but in a town like Cedar Grove, they carried weight. Malik nodded respectfully. "Thank you, Your Honor." There was no triumph in his tone, no bitterness either, only acknowledgement. In the front row, Richard Collins shifted in his seat. He stood slowly, smoothing the front of his suit jacket as if steadying himself before a difficult conversation. He was a proud man by nature, accustomed to being right. Public apology did not come easily to him. He approached Malik after the judge exited. Up close, Richard looked older than he had weeks before. The tension that had sharpened his features earlier had been replaced by something more human: regret. "I owe you more than a handshake," Richard said quietly. Malik met his gaze without hostility. "I should have waited for facts," Richard continued. "Instead, I let fear decide." He extended his hand. Malik accepted it. "It's done," Malik replied calmly. But Richard was not finished. "If there's ever anything I can do—" Malik shook his head gently. "Treat the next man fairly. That's enough." Richard's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Outside the courthouse, Maple Street residents filtered down the steps together. The quiet between them felt different now. Not strained, but contemplative. Tom Bradley approached Malik hesitantly. His earlier confidence had dissolved entirely. He avoided eye contact at first. "I shouldn't have assumed," Tom muttered. Malik regarded him evenly. "You saw what you thought you saw." Tom nodded once, but he understood the deeper meaning. Assumptions have consequences. Weeks passed. Winter crept further into Cedar Grove, frosting rooftops in the early mornings. The tension that had gripped Maple Street slowly transformed into something quieter, an awareness. One Saturday afternoon, Sandra Miller proposed something unexpected. "We should do a block gathering," she suggested to Mrs. Porter while arranging flowers outside the shop. "Something simple, potluck style." Mrs. Porter, warm-hearted as ever, agreed immediately. "It's time," she said. And so, 3 weeks after the ruling, Maple Street hosted its first small community gathering in years. String lights were draped between porch posts. Folding tables lined the sidewalks. Children ran between lawns bundled in bright winter coats. The scent of baked casseroles and grilled burgers mixed with cold air. Malik arrived reluctantly at first, unsure of what role he would play. But as he stepped onto the sidewalk, conversations paused, not in suspicion, but in recognition. Sandra waved him over. "We saved you a seat," she said. It was a small sentence, but it carried meaning. For the first time since moving to Maple Street, Malik was not standing at the edge of a circle. He was inside it. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman sat beside him beneath a thick wool shawl. She had grown more animated in recent weeks, her earlier guardedness replaced by unexpected warmth. She spoke often of her late husband now, sharing stories with Malik about Daniel's stubborn sense of justice. "You remind me of him," she said once, stirring her tea gently. Malik smiled faintly. "I'll take that as a compliment." Their friendship had formed naturally after that first shared cup of tea. Malik began checking in on her twice a week, helping with minor repairs around her home, fixing a loose cabinet hinge, adjusting a faulty thermostat. Winston the tabby had even warmed to him, occasionally jumping into his lap without ceremony. Across the street, Brian Keller approached Malik with a folded brochure in hand. "I heard you're starting your own service," Brian said, clearing his throat. Malik nodded. Thinking about it. In truth, he had already begun paperwork to establish Thompson Electrical Services officially. What had once been informal freelance work would now become something structured, licensed, insured, visible. Brian extended the brochure awkwardly. "We need some wiring updated in the garage. Figured we'd call you." Malik took the paper. Laura stood a few steps behind her husband, offering a small but genuine smile. The irony did not escape anyone. The first customers were the very people who had once whispered. Chief Harold Benson arrived near sunset. He did not blend easily into informal settings. His uniform was replaced by a dark winter coat, but his posture remained upright, disciplined. He approached Malik quietly. "I've made some changes," Benson said, not elaborating immediately. Malik waited. Procedural adjustments, additional review steps before filing charges, mandatory secondary evidence verification. It was as close to self-reflection as Benson would likely offer publicly. "That's good," Malik replied simply. Benson nodded once. It should have always been that way. The string lights flickered on fully as dusk settled. Laughter rose lightly between houses that had once been divided by suspicion. Richard Collins stood near the center of the gathering and raised a glass. "To second chances," he said. Mrs. Whitman corrected him gently. "To first fair chances." A ripple of soft agreement followed. Malik stood there under the glow of small white lights, surrounded by people who were still imperfect, still learning, but now willing. He was no longer the quiet figure at the end of the block. He was Malik Thompson, neighbor, electrician, friend, and Maple Street, once shadowed by assumption, carried light again. Final lesson. This story reminds us that judgment is often louder than truth, but truth is always stronger when someone has the courage to speak it. In our daily lives, we meet people we do not fully know. We see their appearance before we see their character. We hear rumors before we ask questions. And sometimes, without realizing it, we allow fear to guide our opinions. Malik did not win because he shouted the loudest. He won because he stood firm in who he was. He chose dignity over anger. He chose truth over silence. And one person with courage was enough to change an entire community. In real life, prejudice does not always look dramatic. It can be quiet. It can hide inside assumptions. It can show up in the way we cross the street, the way we lock our doors, or the way we speak about someone who looks different from us. Education begins when we pause and ask ourselves why we think the way we think. Growth begins when we are willing to admit we were wrong. White or black, rich or poor, local or newcomer, every person deserves to be judged by actions, not appearance. Justice is not only the responsibility of courts, it is the responsibility of neighbors, of friends, of us. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs the reminder. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from and what lesson stayed with you. Subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing stories that challenge the way we see the world. May God bless you and your family with wisdom, courage, and compassion. If you believe that truth will always rise above prejudice, type Amen in the comments.